And good afternoon. My name is Julie Rendelman. I am your host for the next 2 hours here at the Law&Crime Network. Thank you for being here. For the next 2 hours, we're going to talk about a case that many of you are probably familiar with. It was a case involving a man by the name of Anthony Kirkland. Anthony Kirkland was arrested for the murders of 4 women. Back from 2006 to 2009, there were some twists involving his sentencing, and we're going to get to some of that and some of the details of the case. I want to talk just for a moment with Andel Brown. Andel, thank you for staying with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Good to see you.
Always a pleasure.
And so I'm having a little trouble hearing Andel. And so what we're going to do is we're going to probably go straight into take a look at some of the evidence that was heard in this case. And as you know, there were 4 separate victims. In 2006 to 2009, Anthony Kirkland was accused of killing 4 women. One was 14 years old. Her name was Cassania Crawford. The next was Esme Kene. She was 13 years old. Mary Jo Newton was 45 years old. And Kimya Rolson was 25 years old. Just so you understand, back in 1987, Anthony Kirkland had pled guilty to a 5th murder. That was the first murder that he was accused and convicted of committing. He had pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years. He got out in 2004 and began to kill again in 2006. We're going to first take a look at the first victim, Cassania Crawford. She was 14 years old. Her grandmother testified about when she went missing. Let's take a look.
Even though she went out sometimes, what time was it by now? Was it midnight or later?
No, this was about 11 or so.
About 11 o'clock at night, but this was dark.
Yes.
Okay. Did you have some idea where she might have gone?
Well, yes, I'm figuring she's gone to her mom's because she had to go that way, and normally when she left out the house on them kind of terms, she would go to her mom's.
All right. Now, did you see Cassania's backpack? Did you see her ring? Did you see her phone, the things you said she always carries with her? Was that still in the house when she disappeared?
No, those were with her.
All right. Did you try to call her on her cell phone?
Yes.
And what happened when you did?
Well, you know, they turn them off when they don't want to talk or look at them and don't answer.
Okay, so you called that number, but you didn't get any answer?
Yes.
Okay. Did you try to call Cassania's mother?
Yes.
And was Cassania there?
She didn't answer either.
Okay. I take it you called more than once?
Yes.
Okay. And at some point, not too long after that, did the police officers come back and talk to you about this body that they had found?
Yes.
What did they tell you?
They told me that found a body in the woods. It was from, what's that, Blair Bridge?
Yes, ma'am.
A city worker had found this body in the woods.
Okay.
And
did they tell you they believed that was Cassania?
Yes.
Okay. And did they tell you they had actually done had the dental examinations done and it was Cassania?
Not at that time. I think when they got the dental, they came back and told me.
And that was the testimony of Cassania Crawford's grandmother talking about the last time she saw her 14-year-old granddaughter alive. I'm going to bring in Andel Brown. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being patient with the sound issues. Andel, are you there?
I'm here.
And so just, you know, obviously this is a case we all followed when it came up, and we'll talk a little bit later about the whole issue of the sentencing and what went wrong. But here's a guy who went to jail 16 years for a manslaughter for basically killing a woman and lighting her on fire. And the first question most people are going to ask is, how the heck did he get such a great deal and ended up getting out and 2 years later committing all these horrific, horrific crimes?
Well, I think as you know, and perhaps many people in the audience know, this was a negotiated plea deal, and sometimes cases are not as strong as the prosecution wants them to be. So to avoid having to try a case that is weak and that person may get acquitted, they may offer them a deal that's much better than what one would expect. That happens on a case-by-case basis each and every day. Prosecutors, defense attorney, judges They're trying to figure out what is the best thing to do in each case, and it's something we have to judge on a case-by-case basis.
And I want to just turn to Mike Koribanics. Thank you for being here, Mike, again. And so, Andel's right. Sometimes these negotiated pleas happen. As a prosecutor, as a defense attorney back then, someone must be sitting there going, what happened? Because this guy struck again because of a deal I made.
Well, I think sometimes, though, we've got to realize if you probably do these on a percentage basis, this is a very rare kind of occasion, a rare kind of thing where you get somebody who has such type of anger, mental illness, and such rage and becomes a serial killer. He did a substantial sentence at the time, but to come out and have this happen, I don't think really the system's not perfect. They do the best they can, and somehow all these things went undiagnosed while he was in jail.
We're going to go to a break, but, one wonders, and I understand what Mr. Brown says, we're going to, instead of taking a break, what we're going to do is we're going to go straight into the interview by the police of Anthony Kirkland regarding these cases.
Did she hang up because she just met you, or you already in the middle of your conversation?
And I still had to say she saw me smoking weed.
Right. So she was talking on the cell phone when she met you. Okay. But when it wasn't in the middle of your conversation, it was when she originally met you, you say she was talking on the cell phone.
Yeah.
And she hung up. And didn't say, hey, what's up, what's up, what's up? Did you initially burn Cassania up here and then use something to move her down? Describe that. What did you do? So we got the impression that Cassania was originally burned up here by the sidewalk. Is that true? That's a yes? Okay. What made you push her down to the place where you found her, where she was covered in tires? Did you do all that night? Or did you come back a day or two later? I mean, if you did, I'm just trying to get a clarification. What did you use to push her down the thing? Did you push her with your hands? Because you burned, obviously. Did you use a stick, something, I don't know, did you use something while she's burning?
She was out. She was hot.
She was hot and burning. Did you burn yourself? She was too hot to use. You sure you didn't use that 4x4 we found? Because we found a big pole with burn on the end.
That might have been when she was in the stir.
Stirred initially or stirred when you put her down toward the end?
Stirred initially.
And what you're listening to is the absolute horrific statements that Anthony Kirkland made to the police. I believe it was just one day after he had murdered 13-year-old Esme Kenny and had burned her body as well. And what you hear him talking about is the death of Cassania Crawford. You can see a picture of this beautiful young 14-year-old girl. I want to bring in my guest for a few minutes, Mike Koribanics. You listen to this, and we talk about these cases all the time. I'm going to say the same thing I say every time. You're the defense attorney sitting there listening to this. This is a guy who now has basically accused of killing 4 separate women. What do you do, and how do you cross-examine the detective when he's testifying?
Well, I got to tell you, as I'm reading this, and it was on the screen, as I'm reading the questioning of the detective, I don't think he did such a great job in getting a statement. I found a lot of his questions were basically putting words in his mouth. And, the more experienced detectives that I've dealt with in my experience as a prosecutor as well as a defense attorney usually will allow the defendant to tell his story. And as he's telling his story, then seek clarification. There are a lot of things here that were leading. I think you can have an effective cross-examination to really see what exactly was going on here.
So, and I think that's a great point. I want to pull Andel Brown in. There's an issue here, and the issue is that as the defense attorney, you're dealing with not just his guilt or non-guilt, you're dealing with the potential sentencing phase, which most defense attorneys in a case like this know that sentencing phase is coming. And so the question is, do you attack the detective based on, what Mike says is the kind of bad detective investigation in terms of the questioning, or do you leave it alone and kind of save your strength for the sentencing phase?
Well, I think what you want to do in every situation as a defense attorney is maintain the credibility and goodwill with the jurors, because they're there. A lot of jurors have other places they'd rather be. They don't want to feel as if you're wasting their time on trivial matters. I think it's important to be clear about what the statements made by the defendant were and what they mean in their context. And I think Mike touched on the point that you want to bring out that a lot of these things are put into his mouth or suggested by the detective and not he himself. But I don't think that's something you spend a lot of time on. I think in a case like this, the evidence is almost overwhelming of guilt, and you have to focus on the penalty phase. And I think in doing so, you maintain your credibility and the goodwill you've built up in order to try and save your client's life.
It's an excellent point. We're going to talk more about it. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to cover on another victim. That's Mary Jo Newton, 45 years old, also murdered at the hands of Anthony Kirkland.
What made me go up there was,
I mean, that's out of your area.
what made me go up there was that I said I needed an area. I needed an area to bury her body.
Well, I know, but how did you know about that area?
That's what I'm saying. I didn't. All I'm saying is that's what I said when we was driving around. I said I needed an area to burn.
You told her that, or you just talking to yourself?
Just said it. I was just talking to her.
After she did? Mm-hmm. Where you killed her over on Central?
And welcome back. We're talking about the Anthony Kirkland murder sentencing out of Ohio. For those of you who don't recall, back in 2010, Anthony Kirkland was convicted and sentenced to death due to a prosecutorial comment during summations during the first sentencing. The court reversed, and there was a second sentencing phase, and this is what we're listening to. I wanted to ask you first, Mike Koribanics, some of the witnesses aren't present, and so we're hearing instead from transcripts, and one of the situations we heard from a deposition. And so the jurors are making a decision as to whether or not to sentence Anthony Kirkland to death. Do you think the fact that you don't actually have some of the victims or the victims' family members present and live for the jury to hear, do you think that has an impact in any way on their ability to kind of come to this decision?
Well, I think the victims in this case were so sad because he had a pattern of picking those who were desperate, people in the throes of addiction. I mean, the last father talking about, how he thought that his daughter may have overcome it, and to then not be able to find her. She had traveled from California to Ohio, and it appeared they were hoping she was going to get her life together. And, to hear him on a deposition, I think hear him on the deposition shows how alone these people were that Anthony preyed on. So I think it may be more effective.
Sure. And Andel, I mean, I've tried many cases where we've had to do a retrial, and sometimes we can't get the witnesses there, and so instead we have to put in their transcript from their prior testimony. But I never really like it because I'd rather have the family member there so the jury can hear, see, and feel what they're feeling at the time they're feeling it.
Yeah, I think live witnesses are always preferred, but as you acknowledge, Julie, there's some times where that's just not possible. And even here, as we listen to the transcripts and the depositions, you can still get a feel of the chilling nature that Anthony Kirkland committed these crimes in, as he matter-of-factly talks about the details of disposing of bodies, of looking for a place to burn the body, of how he conducted the killings and other things like that. I think that is very impactful on a jury that's listening to that testimony, even though it's not live.
Incredibly powerful testimony when it comes to listening to his matter-of-factness in regards to the murders of these women. We're going to take a moment to hear from Aaron Keller. He's going to talk a little bit about this afternoon's Daily Debrief.
Julie, good to see you again. Coming up tonight on the Debrief, we're going to talk a little bit about a cell phone linked to former Trump attorney Michael Cohen. Of course, Michael Cohen getting ready to serve a prison sentence related to the crimes that he admitted to involving campaign finance and whatnot. But a new report out of Washington, D.C. indicating that Cohen, or a phone linked to Cohen, I should say, was turned up somehow in the Czech Republic around the time when some people speculate he may have also been meeting with Russian operatives there. Again, this is a report coming out of Washington today. We're going to break down the legal implications of that. Also, we've been talking about Kevin Spacey facing criminal charges in Massachusetts. We know that he has filed some new defense documents that shed some light on exactly how he's planning to go up against those criminal charges. We will break those down. Also, we've been talking for a couple of days about the government shutdown. Courts are coming out in different ways on exactly how the shutdown is affecting litigation, and we're going to talk about how one law is being affected by the shutdown. Also, criminal justice reform has been a hot topic in Washington for the last several weeks. We're going to talk about one famous defendant who's already trying to get out of her prison sentence because of that reform bill. That's coming up tonight on the Daily Debrief at 5 o'clock Eastern. Julie, I hope to see you then.
Thank you. It sounds very interesting, and I hope everyone stays tuned. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get back into Anthony Kirkland, and we're going to talk about another victim. Let's take a break. And welcome back. That was more testimony of Anthony Kirkland's confession regarding Esme Kenney. As many of you know, in 2010, Anthony Kirkland was convicted and sentenced to death. During the sentencing phase, the prosecutor made a vital error. He made the following comment. He commented that the murders of Esme Kenney and Cassandra Crawford would be freebies unless he got death. The appellate court determined that that was not good and reversed, and that's why we ended up doing a second sentencing, as we see here. I want to turn to Andel Brown. You know, as a prosecutor, Andel, you got to be really careful what you say to the jurors, because this is one sentence out of a million, and an appellate court determined that that in and of itself denied the defendant of his due process rights. What are your thoughts?
I have to agree with the appellate court, Julie. And as you said, a prosecutor has to be very careful about what they're saying here by implying that if he did not get the death penalty, that those other murders would be freebies, is asking the juries to consider something other than what is before them, something other than the four corners of this particular case, the aggravating factors, and whatever mitigating factors may be there that they could use to decide whether or not this person should face the death penalty. Things outside of that are improper, and when the prosecution makes a statement like this, it is prejudicial, and I think the appellate courts got it right here.
I think they got it. I absolutely think they got it right. And one always wonders when it comes to the prosecution whether or not they thought out what they were going to say prior to saying it. And Mike, you know, one of the things we talked about was the fact that he was allowed, Anthony Kirkland was allowed to plead guilty to the two adult murders, the two women that were adults when they were killed, which we always, as New York attorneys and New Jersey attorneys, find like, how the heck does that happen, that he kind of can pick and choose which cases he admits guilt and yet the other trials continue?
It amazes me, and it amazes me in this kind of scenario, because I think as prosecutors with this case, listen, we all do the kind of work we do because we're emotional and we're passionate about what we do, whatever side we're on. And I think sometimes that sort of cuts down the filter of what we say. But this, sometimes I agree with you both as far as, you know, what the prosecutor said was improper. But in New Jersey, we have a thing called harmless error, where they say, you know, the prosecutor might have done something wrong, but all the other parts of this case are so overwhelming that it really couldn't have influenced the jury. And the interesting thing was, in part of that Supreme Court decision, they thought that the death penalty was appropriate. So it just seemed to go in such a circle.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't agree with you only because we're talking about death penalty. And when we're talking about the death penalty, we have to protect Mr. Kirkland's rights like anyone else. We're going to come back in a few minutes, and we're going to talk more about the sentencing phase. Thank you. And welcome back. I'm Julie Rendelman, your host for the next hour. Before we continue on with an Anthony Kirkland rewind, we're going to thank Andel Brown in Florida for being with us. And Andel, please, I hope that the weather remains nice and warm there in sunny Florida for me.
waiting here, and I'm going to make sure the weather stays warm just for you.
Yes, I knew you would. I knew you would. Thank you for being with us and for your expert analysis. We're going to go back. We're going to go back into the Anthony Kirkland case. We're going to be covering now the defense opening statements. The defense is attempting to save the life of Anthony Kirkland at the death penalty sentencing phase. Let's take a look.